There was a pretty big shakeup for Scream 7 this last week because it was announced that Melissa Barrera was fired and Jenna Ortega would no longer be returning to reprise the role of her character. And a lot of people are basically creating a timeline of these two situations. They were saying like, okay, it was announced that Melissa Barrera was fired, and then it was announced that Jenna Ortega was leaving. So they're thinking like those are how the sequence actually transpired. But I kind of believe the studio in this manner when they're saying that Jenna Ortega decided that she was going to leave before all of this, because there is more evidence to suggest this. And in a way, it does actually seem like that the Jenna Ortega deciding to leave is kind of the reason why Melissa Barrera was fired. But first, let's just kind of get into this article from Variety that's kind of going into a little bit more detail. So this is the headline. Scream 7 faces full creative reboot after losing Jenna Ortega, Neve Campbell, and Patrick Dempsey on wish list. And that's because they're both characters in previous Scream movies. Neve Campbell is kind of the face of the franchise, and Patrick Dempsey is her husband in this franchise. So I can see why they'd want to just bring them back for this future installment. But when talking about Melissa Barrera being fired and kind of why the sequence of events don't really transpire in the way a lot of fans of the franchise think, this is what this article has to say. So that decision, and that is the decision to fire Melissa Barrera, was made after the company was notified that Jenna Ortega, whose star has risen considerably since she joined the beloved Wes Craven horror series, would not return due to scheduling conflicts with the second season of her smash hit Wednesday. So as you can see, this is why the official story is that Jenna Ortega decided to leave, and then it was announced afterwards, or the decision was made afterwards to fire Melissa Barrera. And keep in mind, firing is kind of like the colloquial term for this. In a way, it was just they decided not to renew her contract because she was only contracted for the first two movies as well as Jenna Ortega. Jenna Ortega decided to leave the project, and they decided not to continue it with Melissa Barrera, and that could be a creative decision. They're like, well, if we only have one of the sisters in this movie, then maybe we should just go a different route. She made a post that the executives at the studio didn't like on social media, so they're like, okay, well, this just kind of makes our decision a little bit easier why we don't want to continue with her. And some people would probably object to this and saying like this isn't how the events transpired, but you got to take into consideration that Jenna Ortega has more investment in Wednesday than she does with the Scream movies, because in the Scream movies, she's just an actor in it, versus in Wednesday, it's the role that actually blew up her profile. And also she's an executive producer on the next season. It was a really popular show. It did really well. So I can see why she would want to choose to pursue that as opposed to pursue Scream if the schedules do in fact conflict with each other. But there is other articles from the past that kind of suggest that they weren't sure whether she would return for the movie. And this is from the Hollywood Reporter from last August. As you can see, sources say the actors do not have deals for the new installment, but are expected to return once the dual writer and actor strikes are settled. Ortega's deal will be one to watch, as the actress signed on to the franchise before she was catapulted to the A-list thanks to Netflix's Wednesday. But despite all this evidence, there's people on social media who still think that Jenna Ortega left in solidarity with her. I mean, this article from Newsweek kind of has some Twitter posts and other social media posts from people who think that this is going to be the end of the Scream franchise for some reason, as if Jenna Ortega is the one who created the Scream franchise. Praying Jenna Ortega drops from Scream 7. She doesn't need that movie, but they definitely need her. She's the only reason the box office was as good as it was. I mean, I think that's debatable. The last two movies did do really well at the box office, but you have to keep in mind the fifth movie, it was marketed on having Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, and David Arquette. Even though they were secondary characters, the marketing implied that they were the main characters. The sixth movie was the highest grossing one in the whole franchise. And I think, yeah, Jenna Ortega's profile maybe helped with that too a bit. But when you adjust for inflation, it's the third highest grossing one in the franchise behind Scream 1 and 2, which are, in my opinions, the best movies in the franchise. I don't necessarily think that the Scream movies necessarily need her in it. I mean, they could bring back Neve Campbell if they wanted to, and I think it would still do just as well. I mean, they can also bring back Courtney Cox too. So I think the Scream franchise will be definitely fine, but I do like other people also pointing out that Jenna Ortega has been showing support for Palestine for years, which to me, that lends more credibility to the argument that they just use that as an excuse for why they fired Melissa Barrera. But like my initial point was that Jenna Ortega deciding to leave was the reason they decided to get rid of Melissa Barrera. So Jenna Ortega is kind of responsible for all this. And either way, the Scream movies, I think they are going to be fine. Jenna Ortega is going to be fine with Wednesday. And the only one who's actually really caught up in the crossfire, who's kind of has it bad, is Melissa Barrera. But I mean, that's just how things go sometimes.